Good evening, and welcome to Beyond Death's Gate. In this story, we follow a man named David Caldwell and how he became a disciple of death, known as the Woodsman. David Caldwell was a reclusive man who lived alone with his dog Rose. Both his parents had died fairly early in his life, his mother when he was just 7 due to a terminal illness, and his father when he was 13 due to a wolf that had attacked them both while they were out on a walk on one of the many trails that David still walked to this day. It had been his father that taught David most of the skills that had kept him alive until now: gathering, trapping, fishing, foraging, and many other much-needed life skills. The only living beings in David's life was his dog Rose, named after his mother, and the occasional visitor from the village a few miles away. He spent most of his time at the cabin making new tools and designing new traps that he planned on using out on the trails eventually. If he wasn't occupied with building, he would walk the trails with Rose, looking to see if any of his traps had caught anything. Rose enjoyed these walks too. For her, it meant getting to be outside with David, and it meant that she was getting some fresh food to carry home from his traps. It was one of these days that they were both out on one of the walks when David noticed something odd. It was around his 11th trap that he was checking that he noticed. Every trap he came across, every single one of his handcrafted traps, had been triggered with nothing captured, almost as if something bigger had been setting them off intentionally. Or worse, something out there was stealing from all of his traps. His suspicions were confirmed upon finding half of a rabbit's body left behind on his 12th trap. Something was out here. Something was stealing the animals that he took so long to earn. Around some of the traps, David noticed animal tracks that looked like a large paw print, a wolf's prints. He hadn't seen wolves in the area in years, not since his father died. He started following the tracks best he could. It wasn't easy, seeing how the tracks were just barely visible. It was only when the sun had started to dip below the horizon that David realized just how late it was. He had no light source with him, as he normally never stayed out this long. The only tools he had on him were his knife and his hatchet that had been given to him so many years ago. He turned back to Rose and yelled out to her,
"Come on, Rose. It's getting late. Let's go back home."
As he turned to start walking back home, he heard it. A low howl pierced through the forest like a spear through water. Wolves had not been in the area in years. Not since the incident, at least. He started to run home now, but as he started to run, a dark mist started to engulf the area, hindering his vision. Rose started to growl beside him, letting him know that something, or maybe someone, was near. The howl started to grow. Growls echoed from the thick mist that surrounded him. In a flash, a huge creature leapt out from the mist, knocking David to the ground. He grabbed at his knife, but when he raised it to defend himself, the creature was gone. But so was Rose. He grunted as he raised himself back to his feet. Shrieks and whimpers escaped from the mist of what he could only assume was Rose fighting off whatever creature had knocked him down. In fear of what may have been happening to his only friend, he leapt to his feet and ran in the direction of the cries, knife raised in preparation. He met no resistance when running through the mist, even if he couldn't see where he was going. When he eventually found Rose, she was a bloody mess, barely alive. Parts of her body had been torn completely apart, and bones could be seen past what was left of the flesh. She was whimpering quietly, and David knew there was nothing he could do. He dropped to his knees to comfort the dog. She tried to pull away, and she was scared of his touch. Once she realized it was David, she calmed herself.
"Don't worry, Rose. I'm here. You're gonna be okay."
She was dying. She knew it, and David knew it. Whatever or whoever did this to Rose wanted David to see it, wanted him to watch her suffer in the last moments of her life. He looked at his knife and looked down to Rose, tears forming in his eyes. He stuck the knife in the dog's neck, holding her down so she couldn't fight back, finally ending her pain. But in turn, killing the only friend he's ever had. After a moment, he heard it again. The snarl of the creature, this time right behind him. This time he would be ready. He stood fast and held his knife firm, pulling his axe from his belt and holding it in the opposite hand. But no matter where he looked, it seemed that the creature was always just behind him. The growls and snarls becoming louder and louder, seemingly coming from just right behind him. No matter where he turned, he couldn't see where it was.
Run.
He started to run, not knowing why,
Please.
not knowing where.
Stop.
The mist still blocking most of his vision. He hacked away at vegetation as he ran, the growls closing in close behind him. From the corners of his vision, he could see a figure standing, watching him. When he turned to get a better look, he lost his footing and fell into a small ditch, hitting his head on a thick root, knocking him unconscious. He awoke in his cabin, laying on the bed.
How did I get back here? A dream, perhaps?
Everything seemed normal, except outside the windows were pitch black. No light entered the cabin, the only light being a candle sitting on the table.
I don't remember lighting a candle,
David said to himself. He got up to blow it out, but as he approached the table, the candle flickered and went out on its own. In the darkness, David could hear something, or someone, take a seat at the table. A wooden chair creaking as the figure sat down. David stood motionless, not even willing to breathe in fear of whatever it was hurt him. He could hear the figure leaning over the table and grabbing the candle holder. In a flash, the candle was lit again, and David could now see the figure sitting at the table. It was a much older man, maybe in his 60s to 70s. His face unseen as he was wearing a hood that hid most of the light from his face.
Sit.
The man said. As if against his own free will, David took the seat and sat across from the man. David started to speak but could barely get out one word before the man interrupted him.
I'd like to make a deal,
The man said in his low, rough voice.
I've seen the things you've built here, and I'd like to utilize your particular skills.
David sat for a moment, unable to comprehend what was even going on.
I don't make deals with strangers,
David replied.
and especially not ones that show up in darkness when I'm in the middle of sleep.
A smile crept across the man's face.
I'm sure I can make quite a tempting offer.
The man said back.
I'm sure you'd like to see your Rose again. Your father, your mother, maybe.
Upon hearing Rose's name, a look of surprise hit David's face. That had been a dream, he thought. Well, more of a terrible nightmare. But still, was it actually real? Was Rose really dead? How could this man bring them all back?
How? What do I have to do?
Asked David. The smile grew wider on the man's face.
All I ask is that you work for me for a while. I find a unique fondness of these traps of yours. All you have to do is shake my hand, and all things agreed will be returned.
David sat and thought for a moment. The thought of never seeing Rose again filled his mind, but he'd do anything to bring his friend back.
You only want me to build traps for you?
David asked, and the man said again.
Your work will be mine for a while. That's all I ask.
The man held out his hand, and his gaze pierced into David. David sat and thought for a moment about Rose, about his parents, about who this stranger was and how they could bring them all back. He reluctantly held up his hand and returned the handshake.
Anything for Rose,
David said, and everything went black again. David woke up in the ditch he had fallen into in what he thought had been a dream. The woods were calm now. The mist had cleared. The full moon's light shot through the trees, illuminating the forest around him. He could hear a barking of a dog nearby.
Rose?
David sat quietly. He heard the barking again.
Rose!
David yelled out, trying to get the dog's attention. In a moment, Rose found David still lying in the ditch. He got up and brushed himself off, smiling to himself. He knelt down and hugged the dog that he thought he had lost, held her as tight as he ever could, tears falling from his eyes.
I thought I'd lost you,
David cried. He slowly stood, eyes now red and bloodshot from crying.
Let's go home, Cal,
David told Rose. Rose started leading David back to the cabin he'd been trying to get back to so frantically earlier in the night. But as they started to get close to the cabin, David could see a flicker of light inside, and smoke coming from the chimney.
I don't remember lighting the fire,
David said to himself. They approached together, and Rose started to run toward the cabin, barking to let whoever was inside know they were coming back. David ran to try and catch up with Rose, but stopped when he saw the cabin door open. Standing there was his mother, who he hadn't seen in 27 years.
Frank!
She yelled inside the house.
There's a dog outside!
As David watched, he saw his father, who he hadn't seen since the wolf attack that had killed him 21 years ago. How were they alive? Was it the magic of the man he had made a deal with? He started to run toward the cabin, the fastest he had ever run.
Mom! Dad!
He yelled, but they paid no attention toward his yells. He yelled again.
Mother! Father! It's me, David!
But still, they didn't reply, as if they couldn't see him. He could see them both outside petting Rose and giving her scraps from an earlier meal in the day. David stood there not knowing what was going on when he heard a voice behind him.
I did say you could see them again, didn't I?
David just stood there, not wanting to move.
I don't understand. How can I see them, but they can't see or hear me?
David replied to the voice.
In time, my boy. In time you will understand. Now, come with me. We have much work to do.
David, getting one last look at his family, turned around and followed the man. And as he followed, both figures were shrouded by a black mist, eventually being unable to be seen. The only thing left behind once the mist cleared was the knife that David had used earlier in the night. Through the years working under the man, David became known as the Woodsman. He was known for his expert craftsmanship of traps that death used to capture the forsaken souls that got lost within the gates. Every day, David hoping he'll get to see his family once again. Thank you all for listening to this story from Beyond Death's Gate. Please remember to subscribe and help support us the best you can. We'll see you in the next story.